G'day and Kaya, and welcome to the Australians Teach English podcast, a podcast by language learners, with language learners, for language learners. My name is Glenn, and I'm the director and owner of Australians Teach English. And if you want to support this podcast, you can jump on our Patreon, search for Australians Teach English, and you can donate to the project there as well. Our YouTube channel is now up and running as well. So there are some pronunciation exercises that you can do there, and there will be more material there shortly. And I was just talking about different levels of formality and informality in a previous episode with one of our special guests, Reka. She is in Japan, as you might remember, and we briefly touched on the subject of levels of formality and the differences between the levels of formality in Japanese and in English, and especially in Australian English. And Australians are famous for taking the piss, which really is the lowest level of formality in language that you could have, that you could get. So, Reka, can you tell me about taking the piss in Japan?
Taking the piss in Japan. I would reckon you'd have to go to a nice little izakaya, honestly.
What's that?
An izakaya is basically like a pub, the Japanese version of a pub. And they're
Okay.
very, very popular. Very, very popular. I would probably say most people would not really understand the idea of taking the piss if you just approach them on the street. Some people might even be vaguely offended or confused or even felt attacked.
So basically,
Or
like a British person, like a pom, if we started taking the
pretty
piss
much,
out
I
of them.
would reckon. A little bit, I would
Shall we go
reckon.
to the park?
Yeah.
Shall we have a
Belvedere.
shall we have a coronation ceremony?
Let's have a bit of like what is it? What is it? Cheese and crackers.
Cheese and
Belvedere.
crackers.
Nah, but if you on the other hand, if you meet up with someone who's had a few down at the pub or the izakaya, then more than likely they actually open up and relax enough, and they're open to taking the piss then. Probably
The
because they are pissed, by the way, but it makes sense.
So the only time in Japanese culture is when you're allowed to have fun or when you're allowed to laugh is when you're drunk. Is that what you're saying?
I would say with strangers, yes.
Okay.
So if people are at an izakaya, I feel so happy. I can't drink at all, unfortunately. Like I have absolutely no ability to drink alcohol. I just drunk, but naturally
No,
drunk, honestly.
no piss fitness.
No pissness, unfortunately. But I
Piss
like
fitness.
seeing other people getting pissed. It's quite entertaining. And I'm quite social. So if I go up to someone on the street or if I'm hiking or cycling or something and I talk to someone, people often feel kind of uncomfortable, especially because they're not certain. More or less, I've realized it's simply because as a foreigner, I'm very obvious foreigner, which I always remember when I see other white people in Japan. I'm like, oh God, that's how obvious I am. Like you don't click up until you see it. It's normal. But people will have this feeling of how much can I speak English? How much does she understand of my Japanese? So that level of not knowing the communication and not knowing maybe even for some people where I lie in the social ranking
Mhm.
creates a level of discomfort that people would actually have run away from me.
There you go.
Literally turned their back on me and run away because I'm absolutely terrifying of this.
So
Um,
even like just like ordinary conversations, they're so nervous about making good impression
yeah.
that they don't want to be made fun of. They don't want to have the piss taken out of them. That they will just
And
avoid interaction. Full
they
stop.
they will literally avoid the interaction. I've literally gone into a shop where they're paid to interact with customers, and I've had the person tell me no, turn his back on me and walk away. And I'm like, you bloody piece. But
Wow.
it's not, I've learned it's not necessarily at me. It's more a reflection of his panic and discomfort of
There you
approaching
go.
someone he doesn't know how to approach, even though it does come across as heavily condescending and
Wow.
insanely rude. But they don't click. It's a panic reaction a lot of the time. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing. But this discomfort avoidance can be, this is an extreme example though. It's not common, but it will happen. It's a discomfort aversion, really, is what it
Yeah.
really. So
Yeah.
I've learned to not take it personally so much. I mean, my immediate reaction is like, listen to you little, like, but but then I realized it's not it really aimed at me. It's more aimed at the situation that they panic and run away from.
Yeah.
So
I
it's a
find,
bizarre
yeah,
situation.
I find that fascinating because, like, obviously, in my travels in Latin America and whatnot, it's
Yeah.
like you have the opposite problem. Like you feel rude, like if you have to leave
Mm.
somewhere, like saying goodbye to people, like can take like there's always
Like
social debates about like how long do you take to say goodbye
like a
to
couple of
everyone.
days minimum.
Yeah, and it's whereas like in Japan, it's oh okay, we'll just white ninja it everywhere.
Pretty much it can be.
That's the easiest way to do it, to white ninja everywhere.
Honestly, that's an extreme example. So I would say probably my personal experience, and again, it's my personal experience, maybe 10% of the time it will happen. So it's
There
not a high
you go.
percentage, but it happens that I've not seen this elsewhere. But I've also not been in this type of culture before. So I really don't know how to compare. And
Yeah,
it's just what it is.
I find that quite interesting because I
It
mean
is.
I guess probably being in Australia, being in South America, it's really easy to talk to people. It's really easy to say hi to
Oh
people.
yeah. Yeah.
Um,
It really is.
and and then I think people complain about sort of going to Europe and people find them too stiff, too cold, all this sort of
Mm,
stuff. And then
mm.
in a lot of Asian countries, it's like taking that to the absolute
It's the next level,
extreme.
really. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting situation because as I'm binational, right? So being Hungarian, having Hungarian parents, it was something that I grew up very confused about because my personality is quite outgoing. And so I match the Australian, let's say, ideal quite well. So the idea of an outgoing person is considered a positive trait.
Mhm.
However, in like an Eastern European country like Hungary, it's not considered as positively.
There you go.
So, for example, if I'm walking down the street smiling to myself in Australia, everyone's like, oh, she's having a great day. That's nice. However, if I do the same thing in Hungary, some people will think, well, she's probably a bit dim.
There you
It's a
go.
it's a different thing. In Japan, people will be like, it's a bit strange. I probably will avoid her.
There you go. That's interesting because
So
I sort
it's
of
just something different. Yeah.
I always knew like in Eastern European that sort of like in general in Eastern Europe, sort of
Hmm.
displaying emotions and things like this and intonation can really affect
Hmm.
people's like language development and language
Oh yeah.
production because
It's a yeah.
it's seen as not really an appropriate thing to actually have intonation in your pronunciation. So people will deliberately sound like a robot because that,
Same in Japan.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So this is a
Yeah.
similar trait in
It's a
Japan
very
as well.
similar trade. It's interesting because both are considered to be more reserved cultures,
Mm,
where it's seen, for example, in Hungary, I know that if you're reserved, you're looked at as a more intelligent person, as someone who can control themselves better, is the feeling. So it's simply a
okay.
different approach of what is considered socially as an attractive disposition. And just like many other things, it's completely arbitrary depending on what happened to be developed or accepted as such socially.
Okay.
So it's really, really interesting.
So we're all learning things today. I'm learning
Yeah.
things.
But
So
it is very, very interesting.
yeah,
It is very
absolutely.
interesting.
Absolutely. I think
Yeah.
like when it comes to formality and you start learning things about formality and language, you know, I'm sure I had this experience, but I'm sure probably most
Yeah.
Australians learning a language have this experience of remembering
Yeah.
back to their poor Japanese teacher who was trying to be ultra polite, and she's got 30 kids throwing spitballs at the roof and
Oh,
and
bless her soul
breaking
and bless
and
her soul.
breaking chairs. Like, I
Mind
think
you,
that,
the children here do the same thing, so it's quite bizarre to see it. The kids are kids everywhere up until they learn what is the expected behavior, because I just had them in my last lesson coming on here. Like the same thing is like, what are you doing? Why is your feet on the chair? I don't know. Why don't you know? They're your feet, sweetheart. Like, so the attitude I get back is like, not Reka sensei, but ne. I'm like, who's ne? Who is this ne you are referring to, child? Like, they have zero chill and zero idea of formality. But then,
yeah,
as they age up, they sort of learn those social expectations that, in theory, will help them integrate better into society.
maybe it's a
Right?
universal thing. Maybe it's not so much depending on what country you're in.
Nah, I
But
think
yeah,
kids are kids everywhere. They're all shit insane and they're very
yeah,
funny.
yeah. In yeah, formality. What the hell is that?
They
Yeah,
don't know and they don't
nah,
care.
nah, absolutely not.
It's very, very funny to see, actually. You see, like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, you guys are humans too. Makes sense. That makes sense.
So getting into this sort of
Mm,
formality versus informality kind of aspect of
mm,
language, how would you
mm.
rate the Japanese level of formality compared to the Australian level of formality when it comes to it? Don't stop laughing.
I'm sorry. Um, there's an example that I usually bring up for Japanese speakers when they think of me as being very friendly. And I'm like, it's just, I'm not particularly friendly. It's just how Australians are. Like, like I would say I maybe, because I am quite awkward, especially with someone I don't know, I can come off a bit stiff for an Australian, honestly.
Hmm.
Um, but a good example I usually bring up is I seem to remember that there was a situation where the Japanese, maybe prime minister visited Australia. And I think it was Bob Hawke, perhaps, who went up to him and slapped him on the back or something.
Oh no.
Yeah, and I'm like, well, that's how Australians greet you, because hey, you're a human. We like you because we're both humans. And we will, I think I mean, I could be misremembering it completely, but I do remember that it was pretty much all over the radio. And it's like, well, he got a true Aussie welcome. So like from somewhere where, you don't have body contact. People
Yeah,
do not
and
touch here,
personal
even
space is
husbands and
like,
wives.
yeah, personal
Personal
space
space is a little
is,
different. Personal
yeah.
space is a bit different here. As long as you're not touching, you can be right up here to the other person,
Mm,
but they will not touch.
mm.
So even like a husband and wife, you will see them walking, husband here, wife here, like 5 meters between them, and the husband's leading ahead. You would never think as an Australian that they're married.
No
You think maybe they
PDA.
had a fight. Maybe they had a fight and the husband's walking off and the wife's
Uh,
trying to collect him. You know,
there's a good one for the listeners out there to learn. Absolutely no PDA. What is
absolutely none.
what is
None.
PDA?
Well, it's a public displays of affection.
Public displays of affection.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Younger people will hold hands, and that's a more modern thing. But
Mm.
traditionally they won't. And then from that culture of like very formal and older culture, older people also, even husband and wife will talk to each other quite formally.
Yeah, well, I had the opposite problem when I
Yeah.
first arrived in Argentina. I
Mm.
I could not tell who was with who, like in terms of like boyfriend
Yeah.
and girlfriend. I just
Yeah.
I had absolutely no idea. And,
Yeah.
and it took me a while to realize, like things are just,
Yeah.
a bit different here. But
A bit
people would
more.
people
Yeah.
would sort of communicate, touch, like girlfriends of their friends in ways that would start fights in
Yeah.
Australia. And I
Yeah.
was just like,
It would be different. Yeah. Yeah.
just very, very strange. And it really
It
took me
is.
quite a while to actually adjust to that.
Yeah, it
Um,
takes a while, but your brain does adjust very quickly to it,
mm,
honestly. At least I feel so. Like I can't run up to my Japanese friends, especially not the gentlemen, and hug them.
why not?
They would die in a spot. They would probably never talk to me again. It's like no hugging, especially
It's
from a
like
female
the
in public.
the ultimate taking the piss out of them.
I'd be taking a piss out of them. They're kind of used to it
Mm.
now. So sometimes I go past them and give them a whack on the back. And they'll be like, ah, you hit me. Why did you hit me? I'm like, I like you. Cute aggression. Like, like you're my friend, you're my mate. I'm just gonna slap you and you need to
So,
toughen up,
so
bitch.
all of these sorts of things gives me like an interesting kind of recollection that that
Mm.
people often misinterpret a lot of things, especially when they arrive in a new culture.
Oh
And
yeah.
like one of the things that Australians get told is that yes, they're very relaxed, but they're also very, very cold and very, very reserved.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
so like I experienced this when I came back to Australia. I realized it straight away that
Mm.
some conversations take like 5 hours that should take 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And so people take that as a sign of someone not being polite or not interested in them or
Yeah.
not paying attention to them. But
Yeah.
it's kind of actually the opposite, is that someone's
Mm.
actually going away thinking about what someone said and then
Yeah.
coming back to them with the next
Yeah.
question because they've
Yeah.
been thinking about it for 20
Yeah.
minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's how
It's
conversations go.
exactly, exactly. Like for example, in 2019, I actually had the luck of going back to my hometown, Melbourne, with a friend in Japan who's a Hungarian lady, right? And she's a professor at the university here. It's like an English professor at the university. So her English is absolutely lovely. She's never been to Australia, so she was quite interesting to go with because I remember we went into Melbourne Zoo, which is one of my absolute favorite places to go, like the butterfly house and everything. And I knew she would love it too. And when we were coming out of the zoo, then one of the staff was sort of sweeping up in front of the gate. And the staff was, of course, naturally going to say, "How was your visit? How did it go?" Like it was, I'm like, "It's great, thanks." And my friend was like, "Do you know her?" I'm like, "No." Well, why does she care how we thought about the zoo? I'm like, because she works here. And she saw us coming out. It's three people. If we
Yeah.
don't say anything, it's weird.
Yeah.
It's called being human
Polite.
in
Well,
Australian.
yeah, well, that's right.
Yeah.
Like it would be strange if you didn't do that.
Yeah. It'd be like, well, why wouldn't you? But she was
Mm.
so confused by it. It was kind of cute because in Hungary or in like maybe even like Europe in general, it's not really like a thing.
Yeah, it is
Yeah.
interesting, and we were talking about this before the show
Mm.
about how like some of these things with language, like you could be a professor of English, for example,
Oh
and
yeah.
still not really get the nuances of
Mm.
particular languages. And
Of
it's not
course.
necessarily something that you can actually, study
No.
or learn. It's kind of more or less something you kind of have to experience, I guess. That's really the only way to put
Yeah.
it. And
Yeah.
I think we see this quite often. For example, I can think of, people from Spain, sorry to people in Spain listening to this, have a different sense of humor from the people
Yeah.
in Latin America. And
Naturally. Yeah.
I would consider the people in Spain have a more similar sense of humor to people in Britain, in England, whereas
Mm.
the people in South America have much more of a
That's pretty
similar
cool.
style to us, or sort of
Uh.
Irish, Scottish kind of sense of humor, where
Yeah.
we always
Yeah.
are looking to,
Yeah.
take the
Take the
piss.
piss. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the bonding for us. For some cultures, that might be insulting. But to us, what I keep telling my students as well is like, if an Australian does this to you, it means we like you.
Absolutely.
We like you because we feel comfortable enough to make
Abs-
the conversation so personal.
Absolutely. Like
Yeah.
the famous C word. Like
Oh, yeah.
I could do an adults only episode on the C word. And
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
almost everywhere else in the world, it's automatically a bad thing. But
Yeah.
in Australia, it all depends on context, because
Heavily on the context. Yeah.
you call, yeah, because here in Australia you might call your best friend the C word, but
Mm.
you might call your worst enemy mate. Yeah, don't do
Oh,
that,
yeah. If you do the maid, oh God, that's when
mate.
all bets are off now.
Yeah.
That's it. Run for the hills.
So
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
You really, yeah, yeah. So things are kind of a little bit topsy turvy. But in
Yeah,
in
yeah,
terms of sort of like this level of formality, I think it kind of actually does have a benefit in that I don't I don't treat anyone in a certain formal way compared to anyone else. I don't treat my students or other teachers any differently to someone that
yeah.
I would see
Very
on the
democratic.
street.
Yeah.
Um, and I remember well, not very fondly, but I remember very clearly when I went to get my first job in
Mm,
Argentina,
mm.
and the boss of the institute said, "Oh, do you have any university studies?" And I said, "Yeah, I've got a master's degree." And he said, "Ah, oh, they have universities in Australia now." And
Oh, thanks.
yeah, exactly. And he was trying to take the piss out of me, but
Mm,
it just came across
yeah,
as extremely, extremely arrogant and
yeah, yeah,
assuming, whereas
yeah.
an Australian would very, very, very rarely do
Mm,
something like that in return.
yeah. Yeah, I think if you don't know the person or if it's a special formal context, like a job interview, especially if you don't know the person, it just wouldn't come up because it's not appropriate for the situation. Like I think
Mm.
many people who are not familiar with Australian thinking and work and the way we use language is that yeah, we swear very freely
Mhm.
and we will take the piss, but we are also not this sensitive to the situation.
Yes.
So and I think that's where people get very confused. Like, yeah, we will use the C word, but it will be only in a specific context that it suits for. Like, I won't go into a kindergarten and just call kids the C
Yeah.
word. It's like, hi, you
Yeah.
little C word. Like,
Uh,
that's
ab-
highly
ab-
inappropriate.
Absolutely. Like I liken it to in Argentina using
Mm,
boludo. Like you call your best friend or whatever you call them up, che boludo. But you would say that all the time to your friends, but you would never, ever, ever go on the street and call someone that you
that,
didn't actually know. It's kind of exactly the same
yeah,
thing in Australia.
exactly. It's exactly the thing. Like, despite us having that sort of image of being rude or like heavy on the swear usage, we are very sensitive. I think maybe in some cases, I would even reckon I would say we're a bit more sensitive to context than some other English
Yes.
speakers, simply because we don't have that strict level of formality. We're looking at nuance and
Yes.
intonation. So
Yeah.
I would even say we are more sensitive to it, maybe.
Yeah, and I think people also get sort of like the wrong idea about this as well. And I
Mm,
think people often get assume things about Australians that they're not professional or they're not hardworking
yeah,
or whatever because
unfortunately.
unfortunately because they assume that because
Yeah,
our language is informal, everything we do is
yeah,
informal, and it's not
exactly.
true. And so I think
Absolutely.
people coming to Australia get a bit of a shock
I
and
think they do. Yeah.
I've had this experience recently. Like
Mm.
uh, some of my carers, some of my support workers are foreign students and immigrants, and they have real trouble
Ah,
understanding that punctuality is a
it's
really,
like,
really, really big thing
yeah,
in
yeah.
Australia. Um,
Like if you're not punctual, then why are you even coming? You know, it's kind of like that sort of thing. Yeah. It has nothing to do with being formal or informal. That's
no,
just honesty. We look at that more as an honesty
yes,
thing.
yeah,
Yeah,
and we're much more interested in actions rather than words. Like you can say whatever
exactly.
you want. You can
Yeah.
swear like a sailor, but
It's like, oh, I
it
didn't know that one. That's an interesting one. I've
yeah,
not heard that one before.
but
Yeah,
really what counts is what you actually do.
exactly. Exactly. Like I would reckon that I think a lot of people don't understand how adverse we are towards people who are two-faced. I
Mm,
think really Australians, and I think this is very similar in terms of a Hungarian and Australian, so I've got a double, like very adverse to two-faced people. So despite there being a lot of differences in the two cultures, this thing I think is very, very essential. Like if you even accidentally behave two-faced, an Australian or Hungarian might never talk to you again.
Yeah, I think that's kind of different to sort of like say the British, who are famous for sort of keeping a stiff upper lip. So
Yeah,
you never actually know if they're actually being honest to you or
yeah,
not. And I think
yeah.
that's kind of like Australian culture is sort of a bit of a reaction to that very sort of hierarchical,
I think so. We
institutionalized.
kind of rebelled against it quite a
I
bit. Yeah,
I think so. I think
yeah,
so. And
yeah.
so it's interesting how we've developed probably like a counter to that style of communication in some ways.
I think so. And I think, for example, I see that in my students here in Japan, for example, who are more British in a sense. So I do quite compare them that I think British and Japanese people understand each other quite well, honestly,
Yeah.
because of
So
that.
so it's probably
Yeah,
easier for other non-Australian people to learn sort of like the different levels of formality
yeah,
in other languages than perhaps it is for Australians, because my immediate reaction to learning
yeah,
different levels of formality in another language is, but why? That's like,
yeah,
and that's a horrible.
yeah.
That's like
It's very
immediately.
difficult.
It's a as soon as anyone says
Yeah,
but why to any part of language, it puts a block there
it puts a big block. Yeah, unfortunately.
because
Yeah.
there is no why.
No, it's just simply a social construct, right? So
Yeah.
it's just simply those people decided this works for us. It's not wrong, it's not right, it's just simply what it is. We just feel comfortable with it.
Mm,
So it's not necessarily right or wrong, it's just simply different.
mm,
So that's
mm.
just what it is. It's an interesting situation though.
So
But
were
it's
you?
something I do, yeah, think
Yeah.
it's
So
interesting.
so were you telling me before that there's some like 7 levels of formality in Japanese? Is that
Oh,
correct?
there's a lot. I'd have to look it up before I say something incredibly C-wordish. There's a lot. So let's say how many exactly, because I don't want to take the piss here. So how many levels? I think maybe four. May must be six or seven, maybe.
Because in Chinese, there's definitely like a
Formality.
couple of there's
Then
definitely a
in
couple of levels.
Japanese. Let's have a look. So how many? Oh, there's quite a lot. So, I mean, 5 levels. Here we go.
Yeah.
Apparently, so there's definitely like the basic level, like what you would tell a child to basically, a mother to a child, especially a little child, would use very like what would they would call a dictionary verb, which is the shortest basic form of a verb.
Hmm.
So it's quite interesting. Instead of saying, they will say suaru, suatte, sit down, right?
Hmm.
Because they need the short version to understand. They can't focus on a longer word. But then you have things like the basic, people say polite form, but it's just basic everyday form, like going from a can I to a may I level type of feeling. So instead of suaru, I would say um suarimasu, so a must form, which
Hmm.
is what many people would say should be learned as a foreigner, so that you have a basic level of politeness.
That's kind of like the default.
Yeah, that's more the default. Yeah, you wouldn't really use the dictionary form of the verbs because it's too short. So it sounds
Yeah.
condescending, it sounds aggressive, it sounds too short or
Hmm.
childish even. And then you can go up where I'm trying to learn these at the moment, things like a sonkeigo, kenjogo, and teinego. So for example, sonkeigo, meaning basically like respecting language, go is language here. And this is what you would use if I'm like a teacher and I'm talking to a possible student, or if I'm a staff server talking to a customer, I would use this to sort of elevate them a bit. And on the other hand, the kenjogo is basically I'm downgrading myself. So I can, on one hand,
You're
upgrade the
taking the
other
you're taking the
person.
piss out of yourself,
I'm
basically.
taking the piss out of myself, exactly, to humble myself. And basically, I would say those are the two basic large so-called levels of higher politeness. That's sort of like what you would expect to try to start learning at a After like 3, 4 years of learning Japanese, you can get to a level where you're like, I'm gonna
Okay.
try to do this. I'm gonna try to do this because it's like a different language completely.
So so when it comes to like and people do have trouble with this in Australia,
Mm,
especially in work
mm,
environments
mm,
and
mm.
social environments, when I give the tip that we do have formal and informal language, but
Yeah,
really, if someone is speaking to you formally, what should you be thinking about?
I'd be probably worried that I'm in trouble,
Yeah,
honestly.
absolutely.
It's like when your mother uses your
Absolutely.
full name. It's like
Absolutely. A
it's like
hundred
your mother
percent.
using your full name. It's like, what are you doing? Like, I don't know, like Blanca,
Yeah.
Cassandra, Alexandra. And it's like, oh God,
Yeah.
I've got to use the whole name on me. So I mean,
It's
I,
it's
I,
actually it's actually a bit of a challenge teaching students in Australia how to write for professional purposes because
yeah.
if they write too formally to their
Yeah.
boss will immediately think there's a problem. He's going to
Oh
quit.
yeah.
He's
Yeah.
that's when you
Quit.
use sort of
Yeah.
formal language, or he's going to make a
Yeah.
complaint, or like
That's the same problem I still have
any
mentally. I have to
yeah
write to a future boss or for a job interview,
yeah
or even if I just want to ask for a day off because I'm sick. I, I should be using formal English because it's just polite. But I always feel so bad. I want to add like a LMAO at the end or something. I want to
yeah.
lighten it up because I
You
feel
have to
so
use an
bad about it.
emoji, otherwise, like you can't like
I can't mentally handle it. It's very difficult.
yeah,
Yeah,
and probably the only time you're going to get called sir in Australia is if you're being arrested by a police officer.
pretty
That's
much.
that's probably the only time you're ever going to get called.
Yeah, you're not wrong, actually. I didn't think about it, but yeah, you're completely right. I think I would connect it to like, oh God, I
I'm in
probably
trouble.
have committed tax evasion without
Yeah,
even noticing it, and now the feds are after me or some nonsense.
or
Like
probably the
that's where
only
my brain would go.
or the other time is probably when someone's trying to sell me something. That would be really the other time.
Us.
So I
Yeah.
think this is normal as an
Yeah.
Australian when someone speaks to you formally, you're naturally suspicious because either
Yeah.
you're in trouble or something's wrong or someone's trying to sell you something.
Trying. Yeah. Someone's trying to really play up to you. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I
That's so
noticed I
wild.
noticed this was very 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 similar in South America as well.
Oh, really?
Very very very
Oh,
similar. Very similar.
wow.
The only
That's really
time,
interesting, though.
yeah, the only time people spoke to you formally was when they wanted something from you or you were in trouble.
God damn. Yeah, that kind of makes sense, though. I can understand that. Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. I never thought about that, but it's the same in South America too, huh?
Yeah. And so
Good
I
on
find that
them.
I find that a lot of people from South America pick up on this sort of way of being in Australia
Yeah.
much more quickly and much more easily than others because they
That's
kind of
pretty
relate
awesome.
to this taking the
Yeah.
piss culture, informal,
Yeah.
boludear, barriar,
Uh,
these kind of,
they click on it.
exactly. It's the same
Ah,
level of formality.
that's
Whereas
really cool.
whereas other cultures are probably it takes a little bit longer, yeah, for
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So at least in Argentinian Spanish in slang, we would have words like boludear,
Hmm.
pelotudear,
Hmm.
barriar, uh, colombiar, like lots of different words to say take the piss, which
That's really
basically
cool.
which gives you an
That's really
idea,
cool.
yeah, which gives you an
Yeah.
idea of why they
I've
actually
never been there,
understand.
but now I want to go.
Yeah.
I
So
literally want to visit now. That this is making me like, I need to get a ticket to this place. I need to meet these
yeah.
people.
So it gives you
Like,
an idea of like why people from South America can actually, you
mm,
know, like transfer this across because it's basically the
yeah,
same way of approaching life.
yeah,
And so they
yeah.
have different many translations for
Very
this.
cool.
But
Ah,
are there any translations for to take the piss in Japanese?
take the piss. Honestly, I probably would say probably just using this humbling language is the best way to translate it, honestly. To take the piss, I would probably say to make a joke of someone. But
what about Japanese game shows that like their only purpose is to make fun of the people in the game shows?
I would probably use a different word, honestly. I probably wouldn't say take the piss. I would probably say more like something that it's a bizarre thing. I would probably use ijiwaru, which means sort of like a bullying.
Yeah, but to me,
So
like
yeah,
if I watch any of those
yeah,
Japanese like game shows where they
yeah.
put people on like those stepping stones that disappear and whatever, everyone's seen these shows.
Oh yeah,
To me that is just taking the piss out of the
I would
contestants, like
say, yeah,
pure and simple.
yeah, 100%. It can get quite extreme, actually.
Yeah, it looks
So
very
yeah,
dangerous. People get
actually,
hurt.
I mean, in all honesty, some of these shows have had legal issues
Yeah, I bet they
after
have.
the event. But I think in Japanese, probably this type of behavior would be called more what we would translate back to English as like a bullying.
Okay.
So it wouldn't really be considered something that is a correct form of behavior, I think, generally speaking.
Well, it's
Of course,
definitely not in this instance. No.
no. So I think if you try to take the piss, I think people would look at it as a type of bullying. And why are you
Okay.
mean?
Yeah.
So if that makes sense. Of course, this will depend on the region. I feel, and again, this is a very biased foreigner living in Japan approach as well. I feel like it depends on the region. Like in Tokyo, I don't think you could get away with it. They're quite stiff. In Kyoto, you would never make another friend in your life.
Okay.
Um, so they're very stiff people. And it's just the way they are, it's just the language, it's fine. Um, but if you go to like an Osaka, you come to Hiroshima, you go to like a Fukuoka, based on my experience, I've not really been above Tokyo, north of Tokyo, so I can't speak for that region. But people here do take the piss. They don't take it as seriously. If you do bully them in a way that's funny, they have a sense of humor about it.
Okay. Yeah.
Like they will be like, aha, you got me, you know. So they are more capable of taking the piss, which is personally why I like them,
Yeah.
honestly.
And recently in Chinese Mandarin, I've learned it's not a direct translation, but it's sort of the closest
Yeah.
one that I can think of, which is bai wu, which means 250, but it doesn't literally mean 250.
Oh,
It has a long story behind it anyway, but basically probably it means someone is too smart by half, we would say.
ah,
They're undone by their own stupidity.
nonsense.
So
Ah,
if you know someone is going to do something stupid, someone might say "arbaiwu," or
ah,
or in
hold my
or
beer,
in
mate.
yeah, or in my classes, which seems to be a favorite with my students. If I make a mistake and I say, oh, "Sorry, arbaiwu, I made a mistake," they seem to enjoy that quite a
That's
lot.
cute.
They seem to understand that
Yeah,
I'm actually taking the piss out of
yeah,
myself here.
yeah. It does help a lot with very nervous classes.
Mm,
Yeah. Like, for example, children. Mm, I mean, I'm not exactly the slimmest person in the universe, definitely not by Japanese standards. And for a Japanese woman, I'm quite tall. So I'm taller than the average Japanese lady. So I can imagine for a small child who's used to certain height of women, etc., I look quite imposing, especially with cyclist legs.
yeah,
Um,
my mum and her
Feels like a
partner,
wardrobe, as I say.
yeah, my mum and her partner had just gone
Mm.
to visit Japan, and my mum's like
Oh,
6 foot or was 6 foot, and her
jeez.
partner's like
Yeah,
over 190.
yeah,
And I said to them, they're going to be terrified of you over there.
yeah. Nah, they're
You'll be
used
like
to it, but
gods to them.
yeah, pretty much. Like you can easily, like I think last week as well at the station in Hiroshima, I saw a gentleman who was definitely about 190. And literally next to everyone was basically like tits level for him, maximum. So the poor guy was trying to navigate through the crowd of smaller people. So it's like
Just step on them like Godzilla.
oh goodness me. Like he did, I mean, there's sort of like a nasty word for it, but I like to use it as sort of like a taking the piss out of myself. Like the white kaiju.
White kaiju. What does that mean?
Kaiju basically is sort of like a Godzilla or monster, sea monster.
Yeah, that's basically what I said. Like
So
a Godzilla,
basically, it sounds like
white
I'm, the
Godzilla.
white monster coming out of the waters into Japan and bothering the local people for things. So, I tell children like this as well, like, yeah, I'm the gorilla, I'm the white kaiju, like,
There you
fight
go.
me. Like, I don't care. I like gorillas, they're cute. I
There
think
you
white
go.
kaiju is hilariously funny. And, so I'm the white kaiju, what are you? And then usually they'll respond with something nonsense. Like one child today says, like, I'm Pikachu. I'm like, you kind of are, though. I like it. You're now Pikachu. So, and then, it gives that sense of community and relaxes people who might be a bit nervous, especially if they're facing, like myself. We all know that if we're in a situation that's unfamiliar and we're expected to perform, it can be really nerve-wracking. So taking the piss out of yourself really can relax and create a nicer mood, like an izakaya, where
Yeah.
people feel a bit more relaxed.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. I
yeah,
think that's sort of another episode in the waiting is actually how to learn this stuff. We haven't got to some of the things that I was
ah,
thinking of getting to, which is a real challenge for learners of different character language, looking at the
oh
alphabet,
yeah,
letter,
oh
sound,
yeah,
connections,
yeah,
and all this sort of
yeah.
stuff, which again is another topic
It's
on its
it's a
own.
really interesting one. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
definitely.
but I think that's probably enough for now. So
No worries.
shall we end this marvelous
Oh yes. Let's
podcast?
shall. Let's shall.
We shall have some
Mm.
strawberries and cream.
I can't pull off posh. It's like, let's go. Like, my favorite posh, so-called posh name is Belvedere. I think it's hilarious.
Belvedere,
From Looney Tunes, maybe.
the
For Leghorn
butler,
usually says.
Belvedere.
Yeah, Butler Belvedere. Please get me some Earl Grey. Such nonsense.
So,
Yeah.
so if you have
Oh,
an
good.
expression or a way to say to take the piss, to make fun of all of these different things in your language,
Mm.
we'd really love to hear about it, and also to remember that actually, having a laugh, taking the piss, especially out of yourself, is actually like a really good way to learn languages, and also to teach languages, to actually engage your students as well, because we are teachers, we're not gods, we are fallible.
No, no.
And as much as we would like to think that we're Godzillas, we're definitely not.
I mean, don't break my dreams here. Come on now. If I can't be a god, let me at least be Godzilla. I love that guy.
So anyway, from us here at the Australians Teach English podcast by language. For more information about the Australians Teach English Institute, go to australiansteachenglish.com or follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Australians Teach English.